before it became a medical treatment or a medical therapy, it was actually used as a dye in textile manufacturing. This is in the mid 1800s. It was dyeing blue jeans. It was the first dye that we used to actually dye blue jeans the color blue. But somehow, and we're not really sure, in South Africa in the 1880s, they figured out that it treated malaria. I don't know how, but they figured out that high doses of methylene blue orally would treat malaria. And so as a result of that, more studies were done and more interest of using methylene blue in an antimicrobial capacity started coming to the fore. So between 1897, when it was the first drug that was registered with the FDA at that time, until about 1950, it was the only antimicrobial around, really. And so they used it for urinary tract infections. They gave it to World War II pilots and soldiers that were in the Pacific theater that they had to use prophylactically, and when they were in the jungles in the Pacific, for example, because it treated things like trench foot and fungal infections, parasitic infections, and it treated it really well. The major side effect, as you were kind of alluding to, Ari, is that it does dye things blue, and it also concentrates in your urine. So you urinate blue or bluish color, depending on how much you have. And so they used to have all these World War II songs about peeing blue and all these kinds of things as a result of the airmen and things having to take methylene blue all the time. So in the 1950s, when antimicrobials came around, methylene blue became out of favor. However, it became a much more prominent use in the fish tank world, in fish tank cleaner, or for treating fish tank or fish infections, as you described it. And it was around that time also that a lot of studies were being done on methylene blue as it became the first antipsychotics, actually, the first antipsychotic drugs were derived from methylene blue, something called chlorpromazine, which is a kind of like our old school antipsychotic that used to shoot people up with that were going through psychotic breaks. It was derived from methylene blue. And not only that, they'd actually include methylene blue in antipsychotic drugs after that, because that's how they would be able to tell if the patients were taking their antipsychotics. If they were actually peeing blue, they knew that they were taking this particular, they were taking their antipsychotic along with the compounded methylene blue with it together, basically. So you had this antimicrobial capacity, and then you had this antipsychotic capacity. And actually, a lot of drugs were derived from methylene blue that are still on the market today in the sort of antipsychotic world. And that, as a result of its work in a particular capacity called an MAOI inhibitor. It basically is called a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. So very mildly, it increases serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine in the synapse. So it gives you a bit of a mood boost on its own. And then over the last several decades, this is when it's become very interesting to people in the performance world, in people in the health and wellness field, basically, because what do we know? Methylene blue also has been used for a stain for many, many decades. So laboratory people, if everybody's been in a laboratory before, they probably used methylene blue at some point to stain. And what does it stain? It actually stains your mitochondria. And that's when things got really interesting, is when we realized that it was staining the mitochondria itself.
Okay, so what is the significance of that? Why is it being, I guess, a way of phrasing that, to say it's staining the mitochondria is to say that it's being bioaccumulated,
yes,
or concentrated by the mitochondria,
right?
And so,
exactly,
what's going on there?
So the accumulation of methylene blue in the mitochondria is really where the magic happens, because what methylene blue is doing is it's one of these compounds very unique in that it helps you make more energy in your mitochondria, which is the powerhouse, the energy production center of your cell. But at the same time, it actually increases antioxidant capacity. Now, most things that give us more energy, hyperbaric therapy being one of them, actually, is going to create a lot more stress on the system, a lot more what we call reactive oxygen species, because the more energy you make, the more waste products or the byproducts of energy metabolism that you get. And these are called reactive oxygen species. They're called it's called oxidative stress, free radicals. These are all words that Ari and your audience are very used to, given your work. Okay. But it's okay to have these in small amounts, because our body has a natural ability to increase antioxidant reserve. And we have all these enzymes that get induced as a result of this additional oxidative stress. However, in a significant amount of people these days that are already under a decent amount of oxidative stress because of mitochondrial dysfunction, because of inflammation, infection, post-infectious, autoimmunity, et cetera, like they don't have that ability to increase that antioxidant reserve. And so you kind of give them the ability to make more energy, but then you have all this oxidative stress that the body can't tolerate. And that's when they feel worse than they did before. And this is something that I found actually in the world of hyperbaric therapy back in when I started. If I was giving them a lot more oxygen, making them a lot more energy, but they couldn't detox well from it, they would be in a whole world of hurt, basically, in the end, and they wouldn't see the benefits. So what methylene blue is able to do is not only increase the amount of energy you make, it also increases your antioxidant reserve at the same time. And on the energy side of things, this is super interesting and kind of nerdy, but if you have mitochondria that aren't working that well, like you have 4 complexes on it that are called the electron transport chain. If the first 2 aren't working that well, you don't make energy well, because that's how those first 2 complexes are taking electrons from your food and making things like NAD and FAD, okay? But if those aren't working that well, you're not going to feel good. But methylene blue can actually bypass those first 2 complexes. So if you're not making energy well from the food that you're eating, because those complexes aren't working that well, you can bypass it with methylene blue and continue to make energy or regenerate the energy producing machinery, even if those aren't working that well at the same time.
Mm-hmm. How does it do that?
So it does that by donating electrons to something, the 4th complex in the mitochondria called cytochrome oxidase. And so cytochrome oxidase is called complex 4. And so what methylene blue does is it induces genes that make more of that particular complex, but it also just donates electrons directly to it. So the electron transport chain, real quick, is just an energy gradient. It's just a gradient that's created in your mitochondria so that you can make energy. And so what you need for that to happen is what are called electrons. And these come off our food, but they can come off molecules like methylene blue that donate electrons to the electron transport chain, induce the gradient, and then allow you to make more energy. And so that's how it's working. And interestingly enough, there's other things that also donate electrons to the complex 4. One of the major things is actually red light. Near infrared light does the same thing. So photon energy, 660 nanometers, well described, well researched, also donates electrons to your electron transport chain via photons, via the electron transport chain and cytochrome oxidase, so complex 4. So this is why we can use them together, actually, for many people, where you can synergize the work of a red light therapy, for example, and methylene blue together and see an enhanced effect. I mean, you can just go out in the sun and go surfing in Costa Rica, or you could have a red light device, of course, that does 660 nanometers specifically.
Or you could have both. Not saying I know anybody who does that, but
not saying that I know anybody here that has that either. Although I don't have as much sun here in Colorado as you. Well, it's
you
stronger
get
though.
good sun at altitude. You get the nice spectrum of UV up at altitude.
Yeah, definitely. I'm at 5,000-ish feet. So actually, from the longevity research, which you probably know, there's like a sweet spot around 4,000 or 5,000 feet. So that's obviously why I moved here. So
yeah, there's interesting anti-aging effects. I had debates with Dr. Jack Kruse about this many years ago, because he was, this is a bit of a digression, but he was railing against altitude, living at altitude, as being very harmful to health. And talking about the benefits of being at sea level. And I have no vested interest, no fight in this whatsoever, like no bias.
Sure.
I live at sea level. I have no bias towards arguing about the health benefits of altitude, but I went and looked at the literature, and I just found study after study after study showing that living at altitude was in fact protective of many different diseases, and was Colorado, where you live, was associated with some of the longest lifespans of any state in the United States. The lowest rates of many different diseases, but
that does play into our topics a little bit here, because we're talking about energy production on some level, right? If you have mild hypoxia, so you're at mildly, like at a higher altitude, right? We have less oxygen up here. I have 16% oxygen here compared to sea level, which is 21% oxygen. So over the long term, as the body has to recalibrate to the higher altitude, there are some factors that likely play into longevity. But the challenge that actually I find is that, and you know this as well, if you come to altitude, it's a big deal, right? Because if you initially come to altitude, you don't have enough oxygen, you don't have enough oxygen in the air, you don't have enough red blood cells to carry the oxygen, you have all these things that are happening with something called your oxygen dissociation curve. And so interestingly though, methylene blue might be one of those things that can help people, because it helps continue the process of making energy, even if there's not as much oxygen around, which is pretty interesting. Because what happens here is that when we're increasing more energy, what we're also doing is stimulating the whole system to say, oh, now we need to make more energy. So the mitochondria are working more. And so as a result of that, you dilate blood vessels, you get more oxygen to that tissue, and you actually increase something called nitric oxide to do that. And you're also enhancing glycolysis, or basically the breakdown of our food, our glucose, into the component parts to go into our mitochondria to help you make more energy. So it seems to be an altitude remedy for many people. We're also using it for jet lag for those that are flying for long distances and are at low oxygen concentrations when they're flying, for example. We have some jet lag protocols that I've developed with Dr. Ted and others at our company that we really do see a significant benefit for people that are looking to just increase their energy production when there's not as much energy to be made because they're at high altitude, for example. Mm-hmm. On the other end of that, on the antioxidant side of things, is also super interesting because we know that it's actually radiation protection. So like we know that if you use methylene blue, it's going to protect you from radiation. If you're at higher altitude, if you're on an airplane, for example, you're getting more radiation when you're up on, in an airplane, for example, at 35,000 feet, of course. At the same time, we also know there is some protection in the skin if you use methylene blue even orally, because it enhances antioxidant capacity. It's maybe as strong as something like vitamin C and glutathione for this in some of the skin studies out there. And so we're using it in that capacity as something that enhances antioxidant reserve. And like a lot of people that
orally or topically?
Both, actually, both. So there are companies that are using it topically, and there are companies like myself that are using it orally, and it seems to work. I mean, there's definitely some companies that are using it topically, but the challenge, as we've been discussing with methylene blue, is it is a stain. So it is going to stain. And so getting it to a point where it doesn't stain your skin blue and you don't look like a Smurf, but it still can be effective is still kind of a question on my mind.
Right.
So I think the way I think about using it is usually more systemically, and as giving the systemic optimization, the systemic bump for antioxidant reserve that way.
Okay, so there's a subtlety of how you're speaking, which I greatly appreciate, and it's very unusual to hear people speak with this nuance, and I want to delve into this more so people understand it. You're talking about increasing antioxidant reserve as distinct from a compound acting as a direct antioxidant. So
correct.
This is a distinction that I find is I think one of the big sort of health secrets that exists today. Very few people, including very few practitioners, I found actually understand this well. There are many compounds which are framed as which are framed as antioxidants, which are not actually antioxidants, which are actually pro-oxidants, which have an indirect antioxidant effect.
Sure.
Many different phytochemicals, things like sulforaphane, for example,
these are hormetic stressors.
Fall into this category. People refer to it as an antioxidant, but it's actually a pro-oxidant that interacts with our internal antioxidant defense systems in a way that helps build them up to a more robust state. Exercise is also in this way can be an indirect antioxidant by being a powerful oxidant, a powerful source of increasing these reactive oxygen species. It then builds up our internal antioxidant system more into a strengthened state. Conversely, there is quite a bit of concern, and I've spoken to some experts in the biochemistry of this, of excessive use of true direct antioxidants as down-regulating, basically having the opposite effect of exercise or sulforaphane or some of these other things, down-regulating the internal antioxidant defense system. So this, let me summarize this. The simplistic narrative that most people in the general public and most practitioners subscribe to, which is wrong, is the basic idea that oxidants are bad, antioxidants are good, and we got to get rid of these bad guys, minimize them. Of oxidants, we got to, antioxidate them as much as possible and suppress them and eliminate them, and use as much antioxidants as possible. And that's reinforced, of course, through all the marketing within natural health, and companies that produce antioxidant supplements have indoctrinated the general public into that paradigm for many decades now. Everybody accepts it as true. And I would say 99% of even practitioners and functional medicine doctors still subscribe to that sort of basic paradigm. You are part of the exception to that rule in the way that you're describing things, because you're aware of everything I just said, and you know that there is actually an internal regulatory system of oxidants and antioxidants, that our body intentionally produces plenty of oxidants, which are not
Correct. Yeah.
bad, but actually serve many vital roles in our body, and produces its own supply of antioxidants, and that these need to be regulated in the proper balance to one another, rather than just supplying lots of antioxidants to kill off the bad guys, the oxidants. So the way you're talking about methylene blue is as something that increases antioxidant reserve, but commonly online you will find people talking about it as a direct antioxidant.
Correct. Yeah.
And let me add one more layer to this, just to further complicate things, which is that we also know that when it synergizes with red light at 660 nanometers, that this is often used to create an antimicrobial effect due to the production of free radicals. So let's delve into this story. So what is the truth about methylene blue in regards to, is it an antioxidant? Is it an oxidant or an antioxidant, or how is it functioning in human physiology?
So, I mean, that's wonderfully said, Ari. I would say that it's actually both, that's the crazy thing about it. So it can induce an antioxidant response because of creating more energy, but it also itself can carry or pick up free electrons, which are what reactive oxygen species are, and get reduced. When methylene blue gets reduced, so oxidized is usually free electrons. Reduces means you're grabbing those electrons. You're no longer as volatile, basically, and not as oxidized. They're not oxidized. They're not volatile. They're reduced. Oxidize, reduced, oxidize, reduced. That's all we're doing really in the mitochondria at all times. Okay. So what methylene blue does is it actually changes from being a blue pigment to being colorless when it goes to a reduced form. And so one of the things that we've been looking at is that you can actually titrate somebody's dose to how blue their urine is in some ways. And now this has not been studied yet, but it works, and it's been working with some of my practitioner colleagues that I've worked with the products that we have, is that the more stressed you are, the more that you need to give your mitochondria support. The less stressed you are, the less you need. So if like I have a dose that I take regularly, and then I have a dose that I take when I'm traveling, it's often going to be higher because I'm not sleeping as well. I'm under radiation exposure, but I have protocols for all this stuff, but I can actually titrate my dose, knowing that methylene blue can work in both capacities is what it comes down to. It can work as an energy enhancer, and it works as an antioxidant reserve piece where it can give you more antioxidant reserve. So if you're creating more oxidative stress, which you are because of using more methylene blue, you're also able to neutralize that at the same time. And that's the beauty of this compound. And so that's why I call it an antioxidant reserve, because if you don't need it, it's not going to give you more. It's only going to be there if you need it. And so that's what's beautiful about it. It's sort of a self-regulatory mechanism. And the thing about methylene blue too is, as we said, it concentrates in your mitochondria. And so you have the most mitochondria in where? Your brain, your heart, your liver, and your muscle tissue. And so we're working with endurance athletes as well that are using methylene blue because it's increasing their energy production capacity in their mitochondria, in their muscle tissue as well, and also building up that antioxidant reserve. So the hormetic stress still happens, but you still have extra antioxidant reserve so you can make gains faster. And so that's another interesting way that you can see this cycle. There's very few other compounds that do this. And you made a good point, though, just to reiterate what you said at that very last piece there, is that we are using higher dose methylene blue with red light, for example, as an antiviral, as an antibacterial, as an antimicrobial. That's usually greater than about 1 milligram per kilogram of body weight. Now, our dosing at my company at Transcriptions is much lower than that, because we're really looking at allowing the body to use it as it needs to, in the sense of making more energy, increasing antioxidant reserve. But if you need to have more acute need for the energy production or the oxidation piece, or the piece of trying to increase antioxidant reserve, then you want to go higher dosing, and then think about, for infections and even for ischemic events and things like that, where they've done some interesting studies as well.
Okay, I wanted to ask you about dosing, but
a
couple things before we get there. One is, I actually did a bit of a dive into the literature recently to find if there's any studies on methylene blue use in the context of athletic performance. So it's
Right.
funny that you just brought that up. I found almost nothing, almost no research that exists on that topic, which is surprising for a compound that's existed for so many decades and that acts on these mitochondrial pathways. It seems very odd to me that no one has thought to study it in the context of exercise performance. What have you found in your experimentation with athletes on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's been surprising to us too, just knowing what we know about how this particular compound works. And I think one of the challenges with methylene blue is that it's been around for such a long time that it's forgotten about because it's not the new sexy drug on the block
Yeah.
that everybody's looking at. It's off patent. So it's not like a pharmaceutical company can take methylene blue, put their label on it and charge $1 million for it. Now, there are companies though that are looking at methylene blue and derivatives of it. We discussed this for antipsychotics. They're using this now for Alzheimer's disease. There's a new study, I think it's in like stage 3 trials, where they're looking at 16 milligrams of methylene blue or a compound very similar to it in Alzheimer's trials, right? So they're using it and trying to change it in various ways for Alzheimer's, for cancer, because that's what drug companies do.
So they can patent it.
So they can patent it and they can charge, exorbitant amounts of money to make their margins and everything else. Mm-hmm. The challenge with methylene blue is that it's been around such a long time and the resurgence of interest has only happened in the last couple decades. Mm-hmm. And there was a researcher down in Austin, his name is Francisco Gonzalez Lima, and he's published many studies on methylene blue in cognitive models of Alzheimer's, basically. And so he's got some really interesting work that he's done. And he's also done some studies on red light exposure along with methylene blue at low doses for cognitive enhancement. Mm-hmm. There's many studies that have looked at methylene blue for infection over the years, but you don't have a lot in the performance world. But what I can tell you is that we've been working with athletes. I've been working with them specifically on my end. Their endurance times go up and their recovery times go up too. And so you can use it in different ways. You can use methylene blue as something you take before you do something as an endurance enhancer. But if you decide to use it afterwards, it also can help with after the hormetic stress of the actual activity. Then you use methylene blue as a way to help recover faster so that you can do more work the following day. And not to mention, as we talked about earlier, it's also an MAOI inhibitor. So it increases these neurotransmitters a little bit. They're dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine. So you feel better when you're doing your exercise. And I have a couple of clients that refuse to work out without it because they just feel so much better when they're doing it and they can keep their heart rate more elevated while they're doing it. Mm-hmm. This is, anybody from my athletes that are marathon runners to my mom that are on their treadmills when their kids go to school. I mean, and everything in between. And this is not only just for well people. I think that's really important too. Like we're working with a lot of patients. I'm working with a lot of patients, and a lot of our practitioners that are using our products are using that are using our products for people with chronic inflammation, with autoimmunity, with everything that goes around those kinds of diagnoses, like fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue, and all the things that you specialize in, Ari. Because if you're giving mitochondrial support, everything becomes easier, especially at the lower doses of the scale of using methylene blue is what we found.
Mm-hmm. Very, very interesting. And linking things back up with the earlier conversation about acting as a direct antioxidant or not, that's also relevant to combining it with exercise, because we know that the use of direct antioxidants
not a good idea.
In tandem with exercise often actually inhibits many of the beneficial effects of exercise. So that's a concern I always had with methylene blue. If it is acting as a direct antioxidant, then maybe it's actually inhibiting the benefits of exercise if you take it too close to that.
Yeah, I mean, we've been looking at that. I think a lot of it depends on the dose as well. So because the higher the dose, the more antioxidant reserve you're going to create in the system. So lower dose. And so I use this in the hyperbaric context as well, thinking about, well, do we want to give too many antioxidants right away if you're going to do a hormetic stressor, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of it depends on the person. So if you have somebody that has chronic inflammation, autoimmunity, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, they're already under stress and they want to go do exercise, that's going to make it worse for a lot of these patients, right? And you've had this experience many times over, as I have as well, hyperbarics or not. And so if you can give them a little bit of antioxidant, a little bit of energy production, a little bit of antioxidant exposure ahead of time, they tend to do better, and then they can do more work, and then they can continue on that progress. And so that's what I'll typically do. Is it really is focused on the individual, on the person that you're looking at and working with, and saying, okay, this person is under a lot of oxidative stress already. Let's give them a little bit of methylene blue ahead of time, as opposed to like your elite athlete. You may think that they're not under a lot of oxidative stress, but they are, because most of these people are overtraining. They're not sleeping as well as they need to. And so they're usually under more oxidative stress than you actually can realize. And so some of my most highly inflamed people that I work with are elite athletes, actually, that are just about to fall off that cliff.
I want to make sure that we go into methylene blue. So this is something that has become very popular. I think really just in the last 6 months or a year, especially, it's really skyrocketed in popularity. And I have a lot of practitioner friends of mine that are seeing really profound results, both in experimentation on themselves and with their patients. But I think that this is also something that is kind of understood in an oversimplistic fashion as purely just sort of an antioxidant, and nothing really beyond that. And I think there's some more sophisticated stuff going on. So can you talk about what methylene blue is doing physiologically? I guess what it is, first of all, for people who are unfamiliar with it, and what it is doing physiologically.
Sure. So it's a brilliant blue salt, and it has an affinity to the mitochondria. And because of that, and because their nerve tissue is incredibly mitochondrial dense, it was originally used as a stain, and so that they could see certain structures in the body very clearly. And it was also used as a stain for clothing and fabric. And so that's what the initial name of the substance was methylene blue.
And by stain, just for listeners who don't have a science background, you mean like for microscopy, for histology, for pathology, looking at tissue samples under a microscope and staining it with this chemical to visualize certain structures better.
Exactly. Yeah. And then there was Paul Ehrlich was looking for a cure for malaria. And so what they would do is they would stain the bacteria or the parasite or whatever they're looking at, and then they could see it, right? So then they could use different drugs and substances to see the effect that was happening. They could see things dying or thriving or whatever. So they were using the stain through their experiment, but as soon as they added the stain, it killed the parasite to malaria, and so they had their cure to malaria. And since then, it's been shown to be a very powerful antimicrobial for virtually, every virus, bacteria, fungus. We've used it with even COVID. It's been shown to have anti-cancer effects. When we start to talk about how it works and what it's good for, it almost sounds impossible. And I get that. I mean, it's like, I hope anybody listening to this doesn't shut down thinking, how could it possibly be something that has that much of a profound effect in the body? And it leaves the body virtually unharmed. In fact, the word magic bullet was coined based on methylene blue and this particular fact that it's so powerful. So because it's so brilliantly blue, it reflects blue and it absorbs red, and specifically red in the 660 nanometers. And so because of that, methylene blue can be used with light therapy, and it can magnify the effects, because once the methylene blue gets into the mitochondria, it can start to absorb these photons. And methylene blue acts as both a pro-oxidant and an antioxidant. And it does this independent of oxygen. And so there's an average of a 30% upregulation in mitochondrial function. And so there's a number of different studies out there on mitochondria, on methylene blue, for a variety of different types of conditions. One really interesting condition is depression. So one of the things that a lot of people will find when they take methylene blue is that their mood will be elevated, because it has some benefits, somewhat like an SSRI would have, on mood, and they did studies where they started out with a smaller doses of methylene blue, and they increased it and they increased it, and they went up to as high as 500 milligrams per day. Mm-hmm. And this was for a year, and they had very little side effects, and they found that the more they increased it, the better the results were on the depression. Yet there's also some research showing that very small amounts of methylene blue can be of benefit for mitochondrial function. My experience clinically has been that dosage can be unique for each individual, and that there's, especially when you get up under 4 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, you're well within the safety zone, and probably individuals can go more, but that's kind of the rule of thumb that I hear from a lot of the experts out there, is between 0.5 milligram to 4 milligrams per body weight.
And the one I'm remembering, there's one medical condition that's a contraindication. It's like glucose 6-phosphate deficiency or something like that.
Very rare genetic disorder. Typically people know they have that. So the dosing, so it can be taken orally. A lot of people will take it in a sublingual, because there's a company out there that sells it with different blends, and those can be a benefit on the lighter dose. I haven't found as many patients and as many clients respond to the lower dose as they have to the higher doses. Typically your urine will turn blue. That's kind of what I'm looking for. And then the half-life of methylene blue is about 12 hours. And so each time you take it, it's going to have a half-life of 12 hours. And so it can be taken twice a day, fairly easily. Gosh, what else? Methylene blue for like an infection. Let's say that you're coming down with something, or you're fighting a chronic issue with, like, say, Lyme or Epstein-Barr or something like that. I would definitely say that you're going to want to do a couple things. One is probably go in the higher doses of it, and then you're going to want to utilize light therapy to get the maximum antimicrobial effect. As much as you can go into the sun, you can use LED panels, right? So they have these panels. We sell some. We didn't really preface this, but I have a company called mitozen.com, MITOZEN, and we sell high dose melatonin. We sell methylene blue. We have some red light products, different rectal delivery products and such. So the LED panels don't absorb deeply into the body. They're good. They do supply a lot to the skin. Some of the incandescent lamps can be more penetrating because they have more near infrared. But of course, the sun is the best. Intranasal laser and intranasal light, I think, is just fabulous. We're working on getting this little laser that so you can find intranasal products out there, but they're like 5 millivolts. They're effective. It's better than nothing, but it's really, really light, right? So we're working on a device that I'm calling a mito torch, which is like a stronger laser that's about 300 millivolts. Mm-hmm. And we're getting some of our clients using that intranasally, intraorally. You can do transcranial. There's just some fantastic applications of methylene blue, different lasers and different types of light therapies. And then if you really want to have fun, you can stack oxygen therapies on top of that with, like, say, at the very low end, breath work. Moving a little bit more extreme, you can do like EWAT, or exercise with oxygen. So there's some different devices out like that. Or you can start to get into like hyperbaric. Here at the clinic, we have something called a CVAC, which stands for cyclic variation and adaptive conditioning. It's like this pod. So we use that with a lot of our protocols, but I've not seen any other combination work as powerfully at really ramping up people's metabolism and their their energy and life force.
Then methylene blue plus light therapy.
Methylene blue, light therapy, and then some oxygen therapies.
Okay.
And then if you can throw on some grounding or some PEMF, you really got something.
Okay. Let's talk. What's interesting is that both these molecules that we focus this podcast on, methylene blue and melatonin, interact with a subject I've written a book on, which is red light photobiomodulation. And 660 nanometers, as you said, seems to be sort of the magical wavelength, or around that. It's not going to be only that, but there's going to be some range near that wavelength, which is in the red light therapy zone. And as Russell Reiter has found, this red light frequency increases mitochondrial production of melatonin at the cellular level, extrapineal melatonin production, and there's synergy, as you've said, with methylene blue. Now, the specifics of that are, I think, interesting, because this is something that is used, for example, in blood transfusions. They take the bag of blood and they put methylene blue in it and they irradiate it with 660 nanometer red light to kill any microbes that are present. And this is because the red light, as you said, is absorbed by the methylene blue, and then it creates singlet oxygen, which is an oxidant. So we have this thing that's commonly thought of by most people and framed as an antioxidant, but when you combine it with red light, it's producing lots of oxidants. Now, the story is, as we've said earlier, more complex than just oxidants are bad, because we've already said that many things that are oxidative in nature are actually beneficial. So there's antimicrobial effects to me that make sense. So you got the methylene blue, red light, creating singlet oxygen. Now you're killing viruses and bacteria and things like that. It can be used intraorally. There's studies to show it kills bacteria, pathogenic bacteria in the mouth. As I said, even studies on COVID showing it kills COVID in blood transfusions. It's reasonable to think it might also interact internally in the same way. What do you think's going on outside of the antimicrobial effect? What do you think's going on with the combination of methylene blue and red light as far as the energizing effect or brain enhancing nootropic effect? Do you think it's similar to ozone, and that basically what you're doing is creating a burst of reactive oxygen species that's then creating a beneficial adaptive response? Or what do you think's the physiology underlying that?
Well, so the electron transport chain is, so the mitochondria, it moves electrons, right? So that process of moving electrons is exothermic. It produces heat. And so what methylene blue does is it gets in there and it acts to like donate electrons, right? So it's like just like here. So it kind of lubricates that chain so that it goes more efficient. And so there's 4 complexes in the mitochondria, and they're all named based on the numbers: complex 1, 2, 3, and 4. There is a 5th, but it's for this conversation we'll just focus on the 4. And methylene blue upregulates the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd by 110%. Yet it only upregulates the 4th by 70%. And that 4th complex is called the cytochrome C, and cyto for cell and chrome meaning light. And so when you add light, it supports that last protein so that it really fully lubricates that whole system. But yeah, so
since red light photons interact directly with cytochrome C.
Right.